Good evening and welcome to Bible study for Wednesday, the 13th of July of 2022. I am the Reverend James Merriam here at the Wells River Congregational Church. Very glad to gather with you all whenever and wherever you are finding the chance to be a part of this reflection for a little bit of reflection, a little bit of devotion, a little bit of time to look into a piece of scripture that we otherwise might not get the chance to really dive into. We are going to be reading from the lectionary this week. We're going to be reading from the second, what's included in the lectionary from week to week does vary somewhat. There's sort of the interest in keeping certain stories piece by piece over the course of a summer or over the course of a liturgical season or part of one. And you often have even more than one Old Testament story and even more than one New Testament story, a letter from Paul, apart from the gospel, and of course, almost always a psalm. So what we're going to be doing is reading from the second of the two Old Testament stories, which is sort of put forward as being an alternative. How you interpret what's included in the lectionary is itself a question of interpretation, and it sort of depends on the denomination and the tradition that you're in. Of course, some denominations and traditions really put focus on including all of the lectionary text every week, to some extent to get as much and as broad of a range of scripture as possible sort of into the community at large. But when really even a good length sermon can have a hard time really doing a full unpack of even one of the there's so many incredibly weighty, significant, meaningful, and hopeful passages of scripture. Even in the course of 3 years on Sundays, there's just not nearly enough time to get it all in. So this is one of the great challenges, and why really scriptural devotion and reading and interpretation is the task of an entire lifetime, and that we are each as individuals and collectively still learning new things about scripture all the time. Now I'm going to be reading from Robert Alter's very recent commentary and translation of scripture, of the Old Testament, particularly the Hebrew portions of scripture, the Hebrew Bible. It includes Daniel, which was originally written in Aramaic as well, but what's colloquially known as the Hebrew Bible. I'm going to be reading from Genesis, from the very first book, from chapter 18, and this is really the point where Abraham has become the main character, as Abraham and his descendants will remain really for the entire rest of the Bible. But you've gone on from sort of the story of all humanity to the story of sort of a particular branch and portion of humanity. And we're at a point where the relationship between God and Abraham stops being one sort of about introspection and loyalty, or that stops being the particular focus, and it starts being about spreading the beginnings of the message of God and the direction of God. So we're going to be reading from chapter 18, and we're going to be reading from the beginning of the chapter, verse 1 through to verse 10, but we're not going to read the entirety of verse 10 because the second half of verse 10 starts really into a very different story, and we're not talking about that particularly today because it deserves its own whole conversation. So, Genesis 18, beginning with verse 1. And the Lord appeared to him in the terebinths of Mamre, when he was sitting by the tent flap in the heat of the day. And he raised his eyes and saw, and look, 3 men were standing before him. He saw, and he ran towards them from the tent flap and bowed to the ground and said, My Lord, if I have found favor in your eyes, please do not go on past your servant. Let a little water be fetched, and bathe your feet, and stretch out under the trees, and let me fetch a morsel of bread and refresh yourselves. Then you may go on, for have you not come by your servant? And they said, Do as you have spoken. And Abraham hurried to the tent. To Sarah he said, Hurry, knead 3 seahs of choice semolina flour and make loaves. And to the herd Abraham ran and fetched a tender and goodly calf and gave it to the lad who hurried to prepare it. And he fetched curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared, and he set these before them, he standing over them under the tree, and they ate. And they said to him, Where is Sarah your wife? There in the tent. And he said, I will surely return to you at this very season, and look, a son shall Sarah, your wife, have? And then we go on into the famous phrase when Sarah laughs at the preposterousness of such a suggestion. But even in just 10 verses, very, very brief, even in Alter's text, it's not even one page, even with this being at the top, just these little sections being the scripture, and the huge sections below being the commentary, because there's really so much to talk about. This is maybe not in and of itself one of the most repeated verses of scripture, not one in the top sort of the top sort of set, but it is in fact one of the most referenced passages in scripture, at least in my experience and in the traditions with which I've had a lot of relationship. This is the basis where, and of course later on in scripture it's referenced multiple times, the expression that we should be kind and generous to strangers, we should extend hospitality to strangers, because on that basis others have entertained angels in disguise. Now, of course, this is not the only occasion in which angels in disguise have been entertained, but this is sort of the beginning of it, and this is what we're most often referencing there. Now, it is said, and there's actually a lot of ambiguity, and it's discussed at length based on sort of Hebrew pronouns in detail, which are, like many things in Hebrew, are kind of fuzzy, change over time, and it's hard to sort of designate what exactly is the intention behind this. But this is also because 3 figures appear in the desert to Abraham, and it's not really meant to mean that they appear miraculously. It's just that Abraham is in the heat of the day by the tent flap, so sitting near the door to his tent, but in the shade, trying to just cool off and relax during the hottest point of the day when doing any activity is mostly just silly. You're just going to overheat yourself and cause yourself more problems than anything else. So this is sort of in the tradition in a lot of hot climates of the things like siestas, taking a break, taking a nap, not wasting your energy in the hottest time of the day. So the idea is perhaps that he's just not paying very close attention. He's relaxing, perhaps he's sort of dozing by the tent flap, by the front of his tent, in this sort of guarding position, as the leader of the little band, the little sort of extended family and servants who are camping in this location, which is a known location where there is a well. There is a little oasis, and there are trees, so there's shade, and it's much, much cooler and more comfortable because of that water and because of that shade that's available at this particular spot. So he's savoring and enjoying this particular spot, really just having a bit of a relax in the middle of the day. Perhaps they've stayed here for a couple of days to refresh themselves, but it's not that these 3 figures appear miraculously. It's that suddenly Abraham notices them. And his response to seeing these strangers is to immediately jump into action, first to make sure they don't pass him by, thinking that perhaps they would think him hostile, to think that this oasis is already occupied, to not want to pick a fight with the person who has taken sort of control of this oasis, that they might pass along, to extend his hospitality, because he was a well-taught and well-thought-of person, and he wouldn't want to cause anyone undue distress who is walking in the hottest part of the day, who is traveling, and who needs to be refreshed in this time. And then we have this list of Abraham being extremely hospitable to these 3 figures. He of course pleads with them to stay and accept his hospitality, and then he way under promises and then way over delivers. It's almost absurd that he says, "Oh, just a little water and bread. Please just stay for a moment," and then he rushes as fast as he could to make sure an enormous feast is prepared, and that these 3 strangers are put in a high position of honor, and that they all get just absolutely their fill of water and food and get to relax for as long as they like. And he, this most important person in this little community this little nomadic community that he's the leader of, he stands by them, not sit with them as the host, stands by them as their servant and attends to them. Now, when in this whole stretch of things, Abraham recognizes that this is God walking around and visiting with him, is really unclear. Maybe he recognizes God immediately, as he's spoken with God before and had conversations and relations with God. Maybe it's partway through and he's just being hospitable regardless. Maybe it's only after all of this has come, after, as we hear at the end of this passage, these strangers start to prophesy. The strangers start to extend promises that are, frankly, since these two people are well past childbearing age, frankly, pretty preposterous and pretty ridiculous and pretty incredible. There's also the question, because of pronouns, of whether Abraham is speaking all the way along and who is responding back, who among the three is God, or whether all three are collectively God. Now, for much of the length of the church, it's been really a quick way to embrace this as being sort of a manifestation of the Trinity and a foretelling of the Trinity. While in other contexts, this has been sort of like the most basic and smallest sort of party of attendance that it would be sort of socially acceptable to even imagine that God would bring when God went down on the earth. That an important person of any kind and any variety would never travel alone. This is a society going along where it's really the great thing of greatest value is not necessarily of money, it's connections, it's patronage, it's having somebody who's famous and rich and important, who you follow around and you do things for them, and in response, they take care of you. So these are two of God's attendants, perhaps. God in human form, and then two angels also in human form walking around. And there's a whole back and forth and whole debate about where and who along this path this is God versus this is God and two angels, when God is speaking, when all three are speaking, when anyone in particular is speaking. And it does say right off at the beginning that Abraham says, my lords plural, which is, unfortunately, doesn't really narrow us down or give us any real indication of what he thinks of and what he's thinking of when he's going along. Because it's a common term to refer, just a term of respect, of what he's about to do, which is to offer this over-the-top hospitality to these people coming along. This is also a sign of Abraham being an Easterner, because we know from, as attributed in Scripture, that Abraham was from Ur, which is in Mesopotamia, in modern-day Iraq, from far, 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 especially in those days, to the east of the Holy Land, where he's hanging out now. And he would have been steeped in that culture and knowledgeable of the traditions of hospitality in Mesopotamia and Persia out beyond Mesopotamia. It's Iraq, modern-day Iraq and Iran, which are very, primarily you have, because these places are very dry, and especially in Persia, there's a network of wells and oases that you have to travel sort of in between, and you have a very difficult time of traveling if you can't stop at these various oases. So these oases being collectively owned, that no one can shut someone off from the oasis, because shutting them off from the oasis often would be a death sentence. So it's the very, very, very basic sort of a thing of you provide for those who are in the same place with you, if you can. And Abraham, as we hear, being having a lot with him, having a lot of livestock, having a lot of resources, having even just the tent, and being in possession of the oasis, being in control of the oasis, extends this hospitality as broadly as possible. And these three, God and two attendants, or God three in one, come and accept this hospitality sort of without question, as would be traditional, and accept whatever he's willing to give. And now he, of course, way under promises. He says just bread and water, and instead gives this sumptuous feast. That's just wonderful, wonderful thing to all share and eat. And there is, as in much in the beginning of Genesis, there are very strong parallels between this story and other stories in other traditions, in other faiths and in other religions, where notable or heroic figures, unknowingly or without really having a proper introduction, but perhaps we get the impression that they sort of know, entertain or play host to God or gods in these situations, in these oases. So this is perhaps a reinterpretation of those older stories, of those older traditions, or a claiming of that story as being part of the story of our patriarch, of the one who speaks for us, because it is quite an inspiring and noteworthy story. And to keep three in one is to keep some element of the sort of grandeur of that particular story, perhaps even in just so basic as that it's a bigger deal to play host to three people, whether they be three important people or one important person and their two attendants, their two bodyguards, their two support people, than it is to just play host to one. So we really only have fragments of those previous stories. We don't have any real idea of what the purpose of including this story in other than to put forward Abraham's sort of credentials in hospitality and to set up the story that will come afterwards, which is first, of course, God's prediction that Sarah will have a son, that Abraham and Sarah together will not be childless, that Isaac will carry on this family bloodline and carry on this relationship with God. And then after that, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The story related to Abraham's cousin Lot and Lot's wife, who are traveling with them, who are in this group all together, and all that's related to that. And of course, Sodom and Gomorrah have led to a lot of interpretation year after year after year. And again, much like Entertaining Angels in Disguise, is not necessarily one of the most read stories because of the details of it are not so tidy and so neat as just talking about a wicked, terrible, sinful place as being like Sodom or like Gomorrah. Now, of course, it's sort of strange that we hear about Sodom and Abraham visits Sodom, and then Sodom is destroyed. We don't actually hear what the particular sin of Gomorrah is. And since the sin of Sodom is exactly inhospitality, is exactly treating these three visitors extremely poorly rather than extremely well, as Abraham has, we actually don't know what Gomorrah did, but it's a dramatic name. It's certainly a good name, and it's a dramatic story and has really stuck with us culturally, kind of across all the different interpretations. And so your sort of lineage of what happens in Genesis from the founding of the world, Noah's flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, it's just one of those steps along the way, and would usually be, especially in eras when not that many people were able to read, would have been one of the stories that would have been illustrated either in books or very frequently in stained glass windows, that tried to capture every sort of major story that the church wanted people to notice and remember. And so you would have the creation of the world, and Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel, and Noah's flood, and Sodom and Gomorrah, and others besides going through, and the stories that sort of pop out and can be really like well and easily depicted in symbolic or form that's also acceptable to the social mores of the day. I saw an illuminated manuscript the other day, beautifully illustrated, of the angel instructing Abraham to circumcise himself, which just looks absolutely bizarre to our current eyes, but was, in the interpretation of those at the time, one of the stories, one of the steps along the way that needed to be included to explain the background to those who couldn't read and could see what's going on and could identify what's going on, even if with just a little bit of help of interpretation when they couldn't read. So all of this is to say, from the very beginning, and we are very near the beginning, hospitality, kindness to strangers, support for those in lowly situations, and maybe most significantly, the wickedness of sort of the passive harm that we sometimes do to one another is completely unacceptable to God, and that extending extending this sort of the most basic of all sort of common humanity to all those who come along. The actually as what I really enjoy that in his it's one of the short stories in the James Bond like novels, the book systems that existed well before the movies were made. There's a really weird one where that doesn't have any action or any drama or really any spy anything in it, where a person is just talking with James Bond and talks about the idea of the quantum of solace, which is sort of just the fundamental like uncuttable tiny element or quantum, as this was the 1950s, so that's sort of a new scientific term for the uncuttable sort of just singular quantity. And solace being a reference to one another as being fully human in the same way that we are. So the movie Quantum of Solace is very, very different and takes those names in a very different direction. But this short story is talking about that once we've lost this sort of essential and irreducible, at least tiny, tiny bit of reference to one another as being fully human and worthy of human respect, once we've lost that, we're in really dire, dire straits, and there's sort of nothing to be done to get it back. And this was actually in reference to, he's telling the story of a married couple who really have just fallen apart in just irredeemable and completely gone ways. And it reflects, unfortunately, on both of those people, on the one who has done the harm to the other and the other who has gone past the point where they can possibly forgive them, or there's any possibility of forgiving. Abraham never comes anywhere near that, and he is set as an example. And may we all, when we have the opportunity, extend hospitality to strangers, whether or not they happen to be angels in disguise, but knowing that they just might be. Now, I hope you all have a wonderful week. We will, of course, have worship on Sunday at 10 o'clock. But whoever you are and wherever you are in life's journey, you are welcome here. You are welcome as a part of this Bible study, and we are glad to have you join us. Goodbye, everyone, and God bless.